They controlled land. For decades, every satellite above Africa was theirs. American, European, maybe. But now situation changed. I launched a military satellites which can dark US space commands. Burkina Faso has eyes on the sky, a landlocked nation that couldn't even see its own borders from above without asking permission from powers. Now everything just changed. 6 days ago, Burkina Faso launched 3 military satellites into orbit. Our satellites, our eyes, our capability to see what they've been seeing for decades, and US Space Command went completely dark. Not metaphorically, actually dark. Their operations in Africa disrupted, their surveillance compromised, their monopoly shattered. Let me tell you exactly how a landlocked African nation just changed the balance of power in space. It started few months ago, after the CIA listening post, after the drone strike, after I realized that every threat we faced, every attack we survived, every violation we exposed, they saw coming before we did, because they owned the sky, they controlled what could be seen from above. They decided who had visibility and who remained blind. I called a meeting with my defense minister and my intelligence chief. I said, how do they always know where I am? How do they track our convoys? How do they monitor our military movements? How do they see everything we do? My intelligence chief said, satellites, Mr. President. They have dozens of them over Africa. Surveillance satellites, communication satellites, GPS satellites. They see everything in real time, and we see nothing unless they choose to share it with us. I said, can we build our own? He laughed. He said, Mr. President, space programs cost billions. They require technology we don't have, expertise we haven't developed, infrastructure that doesn't exist in Burkina Faso. It would take decades and resources we don't possess. I said, that's not what I asked. I asked if we can build our own, not whether it's easy, not whether it's cheap, not whether it fits conventional timelines. Can we do it? He paused, thought carefully, then said, theoretically, yes, if we had the right partners, if we had the funding, if we had the political will to prioritize it above everything else. Theoretically, it's possible. I said, then let's stop talking about theory and start building reality. That conversation launched what became the most ambitious project in Burkina Faso's history, the African Space Sovereignty Program, not just satellites, but a complete space capability. Launch facilities, ground stations, mission control, everything needed to operate independently in space. I called Beijing, not Washington, not Paris, not Brussels, Beijing. Because China had something the West didn't offer. Willingness to share technology instead of just selling services. Willingness to transfer knowledge instead of maintaining dependence. Willingness to build African capability instead of African reliance. The conversation was direct. I said, we want to launch military satellites. We want our own space-based surveillance. We want to see what you see, what the Americans see, what everyone else sees when they look at Africa from above. Can you help us do that? The Chinese Space Agency director said, yes, but it will be expensive. It will be complex. It will require significant commitment. I said, everything worth doing is expensive and complex. The question is whether you're willing to actually transfer the technology or just sell us satellites we can't maintain or operate independently. He said, we'll transfer everything, the technology, the training, the expertise. We'll build it together, and when it's operational, it will be yours, fully yours. We'll provide support, but you'll have complete operational control. That's the difference. The West offers to do things for you. China offers to teach you how to do things yourself. The West creates dependence. China creates capability. The West wants clients. China wants partners. We signed the agreement few months later. $1.2 billion over few months, funded through a combination of African Union support, Chinese development loans, and reallocation of our defense budget. Every dollar we were spending on Western military aid, we redirected to building our own space capability. The technology transfer was real, not token training, not superficial knowledge sharing, but actual, comprehensive technology transfer. Chinese engineers worked alongside Burkinabe engineers. Chinese technicians trained Burkinabe technicians. Chinese scientists taught Burkinabe scientists. Every system, every component, every process. We built a launch facility in northern Burkina Faso, Not a full spaceport like Cape Canaveral, but a mobile launch platform capable of deploying small satellites using solid fuel rockets, portable, concealable, difficult to target, designed specifically for a nation that knows it might face threats from powers that don't want us to have this capability. We built a ground station outside Ouagadougou, the nerve center of our space operations, satellite tracking, data reception, command and control, mission planning. Everything needed to operate satellites independently, staffed entirely by Burkina Faso personnel trained over the past year. We built a data center, hardened, encrypted, protected by the best cybersecurity we could develop, because having satellites is useless if the data they collect can be hacked, stolen, or compromised. We learned from the CIA listening post. We learned from the drone strike. We learned that capability without security is vulnerability. And we built 3 satellites, small, efficient, sophisticated, each one designed for specific military purposes. Satellite 1, surveillance, high-resolution optical imaging, capable of identifying vehicles, tracking movements, monitoring infrastructure. The same capability the Americans used to watch us, now watching back. Resolution good enough to read license plates from space, good enough to count soldiers at a military base, good enough to see what they've been seeing. Satellite 2, communications, encrypted military communications independent of Western networks. No more routing our sensitive communications through systems they control. No more worrying about interception. No more dependence on infrastructure they can shut down. Our own network, our own security, our own control. Satellite 3, electronic intelligence, detecting and tracking radio emissions, identifying radar systems, monitoring military communications. The kind of capability that detected the drone before it struck. The kind of system that can warn us when threats are approaching. The kind of technology that turns blindness into awareness. 6 days ago, we launched all 3, not from some distant spaceport requiring permission and coordination, from our own facility, on our own timeline, under our own control. A Chinese Long March rocket modified for mobile deployment. The launch was perfect. All 3 satellites achieved orbit. All 3 began transmitting. All 3 became operational within hours. Burkina Faso went from having 0 space capability to having comprehensive military satellite coverage in a single night. And that's when US Space Command went dark. Not completely, not permanently, but their operations over Africa were disrupted in ways they didn't anticipate and couldn't immediately counter, because our satellites aren't just watching Africa. They're watching their satellites, tracking their orbital patterns, monitoring their operations, identifying their capabilities. We know now which American satellites pass over Burkina Faso and when. We know their orbital parameters. We know their imaging schedules. We know when they're watching and when they're not. We know their blind spots, their gaps, their vulnerabilities. And we're sharing that information. With Mali, with Niger, with Chad, with every nation in our sovereignty defense network. We're creating a continental awareness of space-based surveillance. We're teaching African nations how to operate, knowing when they're being watched and when they're not. We're turning their surveillance advantage into a known factor we can plan around instead of an invisible threat we can't counter. But more importantly, we're doing to them what they've been doing to us. We're watching their military bases. We're tracking their troop movements. We're monitoring their operations. We're seeing what they do in Africa with the same clarity they've used to see what we do. And they're panicking. I know they're panicking because the calls started within 12 hours of launch. The American ambassador, the French envoy, the EU representative, all of them requesting urgent meetings, all of them using diplomatic language that barely conceals alarm. The American ambassador arrived first. He came with a delegation, Space Command liaison, intelligence officer, State Department legal advisor. They were preparing for confrontation. He said, "Mr. President, we have serious concerns about your satellite launch. These capabilities in the wrong hands could threaten regional security, could destabilize the balance of power, could enable activities that concern the international community." I said, "The wrong hands? Ambassador, these satellites are in Burkina Faso hands, in African hands, in the hands of a sovereign nation exercising its right to defend itself and monitor its own territory. Are you suggesting that African hands are the wrong hands?" He said, That's not what I meant. I meant that military satellite capabilities require responsible management, require international coordination, require transparency about intentions and operations. I said, interesting. When the United States launches military satellites, do you provide transparency about intentions and operations? When American surveillance satellites pass over Burkina Faso 16 times per day, do you coordinate with us? When your space-based systems monitor our military, track our leaders, and watch our territory, do you ask our permission? He had no answer, because the answer would reveal the hypocrisy. They demand transparency from us while operating in secrecy themselves. They require coordination from us while acting unilaterally themselves. They insist on international norms for us while ignoring those norms themselves. I continued. Let me be very clear about something. These satellites are defensive. They monitor our territory. They protect our sovereignty. They provide us with the same visibility you've had for decades. If that threatens you, if that destabilizes anything, if that concerns you, then perhaps you should ask yourself why African capability to see threatens you more than your capability to watch us. The Space Command liaison spoke up. Mr. President, our satellite operations are conducted under international law and with the consent of partner nations. We share intelligence. We coordinate operations. We contribute to collective security. I said, collective security? You tried to kill me with a drone guided by your satellites. You conducted surveillance on my government for 8 years using space-based systems. You track our military movements without our consent using orbital platforms. That's not collective security. That's unilateral surveillance. That's space-based control. I said, and now we have our own satellites. Now we can see what you see. Now we can monitor what you monitor. Now we have the same capability you've used to maintain advantage over us. And you call it destabilizing, you call it threatening, you call it concerning. I said, the only thing that's destabilized is your monopoly. The only thing that's threatened is your exclusive access. The only thing that's concerning is that you can no longer operate in Africa with the certainty that only you can see from above. The meeting ended with warnings about consequences, about international protocols, about space security frameworks. All of it code for, we don't want you to have this capability and will pressure you to give it up. But I'm not giving it up, because I've learned something over the past 2 years. Every capability we build, they call destabilizing. Every partnership we form, they call concerning. Every technology we acquire, they call threatening. Not because it actually threatens anyone, but because it threatens their control, because it challenges their monopoly, because it creates alternatives to their dominance. Let me tell you what these satellites have already shown us, what we've seen in just 6 days that we couldn't see before. What visibility from space reveals when you're not dependent on others to share what they choose to share. We've identified 4 previously unknown Western military facilities in the Sahel, not declared bases, not official installations, but covert operations centers, intelligence collection sites, drone control facilities, all of them operating without host nation permission, all of them conducting activities we weren't supposed to know about. We've tracked unusual military movements near our borders, convoys that don't match official deployments, aircraft that don't appear in flight plans, activities that suggest preparations for operations nobody announced, the kind of movements that might precede interventions or destabilization efforts or coup attempts. We've documented extensive illegal mining operations, foreign companies extracting our resources without proper authorization, environmental destruction we couldn't see from the ground, wealth being stolen while we remained blind to the scale of the theft. We've mapped terrorist networks with precision we never had before, not just their camps, but their supply routes, their communication patterns, their movement corridors. Information that makes our counterterrorism operations vastly more effective. And we've seen their satellites, watching us, tracking us, monitoring us, constantly, relentlessly, with a level of surveillance that makes the CIA listening post look primitive by comparison. But now they know we can see them seeing us. Now they know their surveillance isn't invisible. Now they know we're aware of their monitoring, and that awareness changes everything. Because surveillance works best when the target doesn't know they're being watched. When you operate thinking you're invisible, you're less careful. When you act believing nobody can see, you reveal more than you intend. When you function assuming your activities are secret, you expose vulnerabilities. But when you know you're being watched, when you understand your activities are monitored, when you're aware that someone is tracking your movements, you adapt. You adjust. You operate differently. That's what our satellites do. They don't just let us see, they let them know we can see, and that knowledge disrupts their operations more than any weapon could. I visited the ground station yesterday. I wanted to see the operation firsthand. I wanted to meet the people who are running our space program. I wanted to understand what we've actually built. The facility is extraordinary, not because it's the most advanced in the world, but because it's ours, built by Burkinabe engineers, operated by Burkinabe technicians, staffed by Burkinabe scientists, a space operations center in the heart of Africa, running independently, functioning effectively, proving that African technical capability is real. The mission director is a woman, Captain Zongo, 32 years old, studied aerospace engineering in China, trained at their space agency, returned home to build what she learned. She showed me everything: the satellite tracking systems, the data processing centers, the communication networks, the mission control room where operators monitor our satellites in real time. She said, "Mr. President, few months ago, I was told this was impossible, that Burkina Faso couldn't operate satellites, that we didn't have the expertise. That space was too complex for African nations, that we should stick to buying services from established space powers." She said, "But we did it anyway. We learned, we built, we trained, we developed capability. Everyone said we couldn't develop. And now we're operating 3 military satellites independently. Now we're providing intelligence our military never had before. Now we're creating security through visibility instead of remaining vulnerable through blindness." She said, "And you know what the most satisfying part is? Not that we proved the doubters wrong, but that we're training the next generation. We have 23 young Burkinabe studying space technology right now, learning satellite operations, developing expertise, building capability that will outlast all of us." She said, "In 10 years, Burkina Faso will have dozens of satellites. In 20 years, we'll have a complete space program. In 30 years, African nations will operate in space as equals to any power on Earth, not because someone gave us that capability, but because we built it ourselves. That's the real victory. Not the satellites themselves, but the capability to build satellites. Not the current visibility, but the growing expertise. Not what we have now, but what we're becoming." I met one of the young trainees, couldn't have been more than 24. His name is Drago. He's studying satellite imagery analysis, learning to interpret what our surveillance satellite sees, developing skills that didn't exist in Burkina Faso 2 years ago. He said, "Mr. President, my father is a farmer. He works land that's been in our family for generations. When I told him I was going to work in space, he didn't understand. He said, 'Son, we're farmers. We work the earth. Space is for Americans and Russians and Chinese, not for us.' He said, but then I showed him images from our satellite. I showed him our village from space. I showed him our farm. I showed him that Burkina Faso can see the world the way powerful nations see the world." And he cried, not because his son works in space, but because his son proved that Burkina Faso belongs in space, that Africa can do anything if we believe we can and work to make it real. That moment reminded me why this matters. Not for military advantage, not for strategic positioning, not for geopolitical leverage, but for that farmer's son who proved that African capability is unlimited, that our potential is constrained only by our belief in what's possible, that space isn't reserved for certain nations or certain peoples, that if we build the expertise, develop the technology, and commit the resources, we can achieve anything. But let me be honest about something the Western media won't report, something U.S. Space Command doesn't want acknowledged, something that terrifies them more than our 3 satellites. This isn't just about Burkina Faso. This isn't just about 3 satellites. This isn't just about one nation's space program. This is about Africa entering space. This is about the continent developing capability that breaks Western monopoly on orbital surveillance. This is about establishing precedent that African nations can and will operate in space independently. Within days of our launch, 5 other African nations contacted us, not requesting, demanding access to our technology, demanding training for their personnel, demanding partnership in space, demanding we help them build what we've built. Mali wants satellites, Niger wants satellites, Chad wants satellites, Ethiopia wants satellites, Kenya wants satellites, Nigeria wants satellites, South Africa wants satellites, Egypt wants satellites. And we're saying yes to all of them, because this isn't about Burkina Faso having an advantage over other African nations. This is about Africa having capability that matches any power on Earth. This is about the continent operating in space as equals. This is about breaking the monopoly that has kept us blind while others watched. We're creating the African Space Consortium, a coalition of African nations pooling resources, sharing technology, and building collective space capability, not competing with each other, but cooperating to compete with everyone else, not fragmenting African space efforts, but unifying them into a continental program. The consortium will operate shared satellites. We'll build joint ground stations. We'll train personnel collectively. We'll develop technology cooperatively. We'll create a space program that no single African nation could build alone, but that together we can build better than most nations on Earth. Within 5 years, the consortium will operate 50 satellites. Within 10 years, 200. Within 20 years, Africa will have comprehensive space coverage, surveillance, communications, navigation, weather, resource monitoring, everything needed for complete space-based capability. And U.S. Space Command is panicking, not because of 3 Burkina-based satellites, but because those 3 satellites are the beginning of something they can't stop. The beginning of African space power, the beginning of continental capability, the beginning of the end of their monopoly on seeing Africa from above. They're panicking because they understand what this means. It means they can no longer operate in Africa with the certainty that only they have visibility. It means they can no longer conduct covert operations assuming nobody can see from above. It means they can no longer maintain the intelligence advantage that has enabled their control. They're panicking because space was supposed to be their domain, their monopoly, their advantage, and now it's not. Now Africa is there. Now we can see. Now we can monitor. Now we can track. Now we can watch them watching us. To every African leader watching this, understand what just became possible. Understand what we've proven. Understand what you can build. Space is not reserved for superpowers. Space is not exclusive to wealthy nations. Space is not limited to countries with long aerospace traditions. Space is open to anyone with the commitment to build capability, the courage to challenge assumptions, and the vision to see beyond current limitations. But let me tell you why I'm so certain of this. Why I can stand here and declare with absolute confidence that any African nation can do what we did. Why I know that space is not some exclusive club reserved for the privileged few. Why I believe that the next decade will see Africa transform from a continent watched from space to a continent watching from space. Because 18 months ago I didn't know the difference between a satellite and a space station. I couldn't tell you what orbital mechanics meant. I had never heard of apogee or perigee or Hohmann transfer orbits. I knew nothing about space except that it was up there and we weren't. I was like most African leaders, educated, informed, aware of global affairs, but completely ignorant about space. Because space was never presented as something relevant to us. Space was something Americans and Russians and Chinese did. Space was for nations with billions to spend and decades of experience and technical traditions stretching back generations. We were supposed to focus on earthly concerns, on agriculture and infrastructure and basic services, on feeding our people and educating our children and building our economies. Space was a luxury, a distraction, something to worry about after we solved all our terrestrial problems. But that's exactly the mentality that keeps us controlled. That's exactly the assumption that maintains their advantage. That's exactly the belief system that ensures we remain perpetually behind, perpetually dependent, perpetually vulnerable. Because while we're focused on solving basic problems with limited resources, they're watching us from space. While we're struggling with terrestrial challenges, they're monitoring us from orbit. While we're dealing with immediate crises, they're using space-based capabilities to maintain strategic advantage over us. And that advantage is enormous, invisible, unappreciated by most people, but absolutely critical to understanding why they maintain control and we struggle for sovereignty. Let me explain what space capability actually means, not in technical terms, but in practical, real-world terms that affect every African nation every single day. Space capability means seeing seeing your entire country at once, seeing your borders, seeing your resources, seeing illegal mining operations, seeing terrorist camps, seeing troop movements, seeing everything that happens on your territory without depending on someone else to show you. Right now, most African nations are blind. We see what's immediately in front of us, what's in our cities, what's on our roads, what's visible from the ground. But we don't see the big picture. We don't see the patterns. We don't see what's happening in remote areas. We don't see what others see when they look at us from above. That blindness is strategic. That blindness is maintained. That blindness is profitable for those who can see while we cannot. When illegal mining happens in your territory, they see it from space before you discover it on the ground. When terrorists establish camps in remote regions, they track it from orbit before you detect it locally. When foreign military forces move near your borders, they monitor it from above before you're aware of the threat. And then they decide what to share with you. They decide what you get to know. They decide what intelligence you receive. They control your awareness of your own territory. That's not partnership. That's not cooperation. That's not assistance. That's control. Control through information asymmetry. Control through maintaining your blindness while they see everything. Space capability means communicating securely, independently, without routing your sensitive government communications through networks they control, without depending on infrastructure they can shut down, without trusting that your military coordination isn't being intercepted. Right now, most African nations communicate using systems built, operated, and controlled by foreign powers. Our internet runs through their cables. Our phone networks use their satellites. Our military communications rely on their infrastructure. Every message can be intercepted. Every call can be monitored. Every communication can be compromised, not theoretically, actually, routinely, systematically. The CIA listening post in Burkina Faso wasn't an exception. It was standard operating procedure. They listen to everything because they control the infrastructure that carries everything. They monitor all communications because they built the systems that enable all communications. Space-based communications capability breaks that control. It creates networks they don't own. It enables secure communications they can't intercept. It establishes independence they can't compromise. Space capability means navigating independently, without depending on GPS systems they control, without trusting that the positioning data you receive is accurate, without accepting that they can degrade or deny your navigation capability whenever they choose. Right now, African militaries use American GPS. Our aircraft navigate using their satellites. Our precision weapons rely on their positioning data. Our entire military capability depends on systems they operate and can shut down at will. During conflicts, during crises, during moments when we most need navigation capability, they can deny it. They can degrade the signal. They can introduce errors. They can make our weapons less accurate, our aircraft less capable, our military less effective. And we have no alternative, no backup, no independent capability. We're completely dependent on their willingness to allow us to navigate our own territory. Space capability means all of this, and more: weather monitoring, resource tracking, environmental observation, agricultural planning, disaster response. Everything that requires seeing from above, communicating across distances, or navigating with precision. That's why space matters. That's why it's not a luxury. That's why it's not something to worry about after we solve terrestrial problems. Because space capability is how you solve terrestrial problems more effectively. Because visibility from above makes everything else easier. Because independence in communications makes everything else more secure. Because autonomous navigation makes everything else more capable. We did it. You can too. We built satellites. You can too. We developed space operations. You can too. We created capability everyone said was impossible. You can too. But let me be specific about how. Because you can too sounds like empty encouragement unless I explain exactly what it requires, unless I break down the actual steps, unless I show you the real path from having nothing to operating in space. First, you need commitment, not casual interest, not vague aspiration, but absolute, unwavering, total commitment. Commitment to prioritize space capability even when other needs seem more urgent. Commitment to allocate resources even when budgets are tight. Commitment to persist even when progress seems slow. We committed $1.2 billion over 18 months. That's enormous for Burkina Faso. That's a significant portion of our national budget. That's money we could have spent on schools, hospitals, roads, agriculture, dozens of other worthy priorities. But we committed it to space, because we understood that space capability would make everything else more effective, because we recognized that visibility from above would improve agriculture, enhance security, protect resources, and strengthen sovereignty, because we knew that short-term sacrifice would create long-term advantage. That commitment wasn't easy. My finance minister argued against it. He said, "Mr. President, we have people who need clean water, we have children who need schools, we have farmers who need irrigation, and you want to spend over $1 billion on satellites?" I said, "Yes, because those satellites will help us find water resources we don't know exist, because they'll help us monitor school construction and prevent corruption, because they'll help us optimize irrigation by tracking soil moisture and weather patterns, because space capability makes everything else we do more effective." He wasn't convinced immediately, but I made the commitment anyway, because leadership sometimes means making decisions others don't understand, because vision sometimes requires seeing value that isn't immediately obvious, because building the future sometimes demands sacrificing present comfort. Second, you need partners, not masters, not benefactors, not donors, but partners, partners who will transfer technology, not just sell services, partners who will teach you to build, not just build for you, partners who want you to be capable, not dependent. We partnered with China, not because China is perfect, not because China has no self-interest, but because China was willing to transfer technology, because China was willing to train our people, because China was willing to build capability instead of dependence. The West offered to sell us satellite services, they offered to provide us with data, they offered to let us buy access to their systems, but they didn't offer to teach us to build satellites. They didn't offer to help us operate our own systems. They didn't offer to create independent African space capability. China did. And that made all the difference. But finding the right partner requires knowing what to ask for. It requires understanding the difference between buying services and building capability. It requires recognizing that true partnership means technology transfer, not just technology sales. When we negotiated with China, I was very specific. I said, "We don't want to buy satellites and depend on you to operate them. We don't want to purchase data and rely on you to provide it. We want to build satellites ourselves. We want to operate systems independently. We want to create capability that belongs to us completely." And China said yes, not because they're more generous than the West, but because their model of international cooperation is different, because they benefit from capable partners, not dependent clients, because they understand that technology transfer creates long-term relationships while technology sales create short-term transactions. Third, you need technical foundation, not complete expertise, not perfect knowledge, not decades of experience, but basic technical foundation, engineers who can learn, scientists who can adapt, technicians who can be trained. We didn't have space engineers in Burkina Faso, we didn't have satellite technicians, we didn't have orbital mechanics experts, we had none of the specialized expertise that space operations require. But we had engineers, good engineers, smart engineers, engineers who had studied mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, computer science, physics, engineers who had solid technical foundations even if they had no space-specific knowledge. And those engineers learned. They went to China for training. They studied satellite design. They learned orbital mechanics. They developed space operations expertise. They transformed from general engineers into space engineers through intensive training and hands-on experience. Captain Zongo, our mission director, studied aerospace engineering in China for 2 years. She had a background in electrical engineering. She was smart, dedicated, hardworking, but she knew nothing about space when she started. 2 years later, she's running our Space Operations Center. She's commanding satellite operations. She's making decisions about orbital parameters and communication windows and data processing. She went from zero space knowledge to complete operational capability in 24 months. If she can do it, anyone can do it. If Burkina Faso can develop space engineers from scratch in 2 years, any African nation can do the same. The expertise isn't mystical. The knowledge isn't secret. The capability isn't exclusive. It just requires commitment to learning and access to quality training. Fourth, you need infrastructure. Not massive spaceports, not enormous facilities, not billion-dollar installations, but basic infrastructure, launch capability, ground stations, data centers, mission control, We built a mobile launch platform, not a permanent spaceport like Kennedy Space Center, not a massive complex like Baikonur, but a portable system that can be set up, used, and moved. Cost: $80 million. Timeline: 8 months. We built a ground station, not a huge facility, not an elaborate complex, but a functional operations center with satellite tracking, data reception, and command capabilities. Cost: $40 million. Timeline: 6 months. We built a data center, hardened, encrypted, secure, but not enormous, not extravagant, not unnecessarily complex. Cost: $30 million. Timeline: 4 months. Total infrastructure cost: $150 million. Total construction time: 18 months with overlapping timelines, completely achievable for any African nation with GDP over $10 billion. Completely feasible for any country willing to prioritize space capability. The infrastructure doesn't need to be perfect. It doesn't need to match American or Chinese or Russian facilities. It just needs to work. It just needs to enable operations. It just needs to provide capability. Perfect is the enemy of good. Waiting for perfect infrastructure means never building anything. Accepting good infrastructure means starting operations now and improving over time. Fifth, you need satellites, not enormous spacecraft, not billion-dollar systems, not cutting-edge technology, but functional satellites, small, efficient, capable, sufficient. Our 3 satellites cost $200 million total. That's $67 million per satellite on average. That's less than the cost of a single fighter jet. That's less than many nations spend on presidential security in a year. That's completely affordable for any serious national space program. These aren't the most advanced satellites in the world. They're not as sophisticated as American spy satellites. They're not as capable as the latest Chinese systems. They're not cutting-edge technology. But they work. They provide surveillance capability we didn't have before. They enable communications we couldn't secure before. They create visibility we couldn't achieve before. They're sufficient, and sufficient is enough to change everything. The remaining funds went to training, operations, maintenance, and contingency. The total program cost of $1.2 billion covered everything needed to go from zero space capability to operational satellites in 18 months. That's the blueprint. That's the actual path. That's what it really takes to build space capability from nothing. Commitment: $1.2 billion over 18 months. Partnership: technology transfer agreement with a willing partner. Technical foundation: engineers who can learn, trained intensively in space operations. Infrastructure: launch platform, ground station, data center built in parallel. Satellites: 3 functional spacecraft providing surveillance, communications, and electronic intelligence. Timeline: 18 months from commitment to launch. That's it. That's the formula. That's how a landlocked African nation with no space tradition built operational space capability in less than 2 years. Join the consortium. Pool your resources with ours. Share our technology. Train your people alongside ours. Build collectively what would be difficult individually. Create together what seems impossible alone. The African Space Consortium isn't just an idea. It's not just a proposal. It's not just a vision for the future. It's operational. It's functioning. It's real. And it's open to any African nation serious about space capability. Here's how it works. Here's what membership means. Here's what you get and what you contribute. You contribute financially, based on your GDP, scaled to your capacity, fair, proportional, achievable. Small nations contribute less. Large nations contribute more. Everyone contributes something. Everyone has ownership. The contribution funds shared infrastructure, additional ground stations across the continent, more launch capability, enhanced data processing, expanded training programs, collective capability that benefits all members. You contribute technically. Your engineers train with ours. Your technicians work alongside ours. Your scientists collaborate with ours. Knowledge flows in all directions. Everyone learns from everyone. Collective expertise grows faster than individual expertise ever could. You contribute operationally. Your satellites join the network. Your data integrates with ours. Your capabilities complement ours. We build a continental system where each nation's assets contribute to collective capability, where everyone benefits from everyone else's investments. In return, you receive access. access to our technology, access to our training, access to our facilities, access to our data, access to our experience, access to everything we've built and everything we've learned. You receive support, technical support for building your own satellites, operational support for launching your own systems, training support for developing your own expertise. Whatever you need to develop independent capability, we provide. You receive data. Data from our satellites. Data from other members' satellites. Data from the entire continental network. Surveillance of your territory. Communications across your country. Intelligence about threats. Information about resources. Everything space-based systems can provide. And most importantly, you receive partnership. Real partnership. Equal partnership. Partnership where your voice matters, where your needs are prioritized, where your sovereignty is respected, where your capability is enhanced, not exploited. Mali joined 3 days ago. They're contributing $50 million annually. They're sending 20 engineers for training. They're building a ground station in Bamako. They're planning to launch 2 satellites within 18 months. They're becoming a space-capable nation. Niger joined 2 days ago. Similar commitment, similar timeline, similar capability development. They're particularly interested in surveillance satellites for counterterrorism. They're investing heavily in training. They're building capability that will make their security operations vastly more effective. Ethiopia contacted us yesterday. They want in. They have ambitions beyond what we've done. They want to build a full spaceport. They want to launch their own rockets. They want to become a regional space hub. And we're helping them do it. Kenya is negotiating terms. Nigeria is reviewing proposals. Egypt is conducting feasibility studies. South Africa is evaluating participation. Across the continent, nations are recognizing that space capability is achievable, necessary, and urgent. Within 2 years, the consortium will have 15 member nations. Within 5 years, 30. Within 10 years, most of the continent. We're building collective capability that will rival any space program on Earth. We're creating African space power. Because the future of Africa depends on our ability to see, to monitor our own territory, to track our own resources, to watch our own borders, to operate with the same visibility that powerful nations have used to maintain advantage over us. Let me tell you what visibility means in practical terms, what it means for a nation to see its own territory from space, what it means for a continent to operate with comprehensive space-based awareness. It means knowing where your resources are, not guessing, not estimating, not depending on surveys conducted decades ago, but knowing, seeing mineral deposits from space, identifying water resources from orbit, mapping agricultural potential from above, understanding what you have so you can use it effectively. It means protecting those resources, seeing illegal mining before it becomes entrenched, detecting unauthorized extraction before resources are stolen, monitoring environmental damage before it becomes irreversible, watching your wealth so others can't steal it while you're blind. It means securing your borders, seeing who crosses, tracking movements, detecting threats, monitoring activities, not depending on ground patrols that can't cover vast distances, not relying on reports that arrive too late, but seeing in real time from above. It means fighting terrorism effectively, finding camps before attacks are launched, tracking movements before strikes occur, disrupting supply lines before weapons arrive, monitoring communications before operations begin, using space-based intelligence to protect your people. It means managing disasters, seeing floods before they destroy communities, tracking droughts before they cause famine, monitoring storms before they devastate regions, coordinating response with real-time visibility, saving lives through awareness. It means planning development, seeing where infrastructure is needed, identifying where populations are growing, understanding where services are lacking, optimizing resource allocation based on actual visibility rather than outdated assumptions. That's what space capability enables. That's what visibility from above provides. That's what we've gained and what you can gain. That's why this matters more than almost anything else we could build. And that future is now possible. Not someday. Not eventually. Not in some distant timeline. Now. Today. Because we proved it's possible. Because we built the foundation. Because we created the capability. Because we showed that African space power is real. I want you to understand how significant this moment is, how transformative this capability is, how revolutionary this development is for Africa's future. 6 days ago, Africa had 0 operational military satellites. 0. None. We were completely dependent on others for space-based intelligence, completely reliant on others for satellite communications, completely vulnerable to others' control of space-based capabilities. Today, Africa has 3 operational military satellites. 3. Ours. African-built, African-operated, African-controlled, providing capability we've never had. Creating independence we've never achieved, establishing sovereignty we've never possessed. In 6 months, Africa will have 12 operational satellites. In 1 year, 30. In 2 years, 60. In 5 years, 200. The growth is exponential. The capability is expanding. The future is arriving faster than anyone predicted. This is Africa's space age. This is our moment. This is when we stop being watched and start watching. This is when we stop being monitored and start monitoring. This is when we stop being subjects and start being equals. To the people of Africa, 6 days ago, your continent entered space, not as passengers on someone else's rockets, not as clients buying someone else's services, but as operators, as builders, as engineers, as scientists, as a continent developing its own capability. Look at what that means. Look at what we've achieved. Look at what's now possible. Your children can now aspire to be astronauts, not American astronauts, not Russian astronauts, but African astronauts, working for African space agencies, operating African satellites, building African space capability. Your engineers can now work in space technology, not for foreign companies, not for foreign governments, but for African organizations, developing African systems, creating African capability, building African futures. Your nations can now operate in space, not as clients, not as subordinates, but as equals, as capable powers, as sovereign entities, as nations that belong in space just as much as any nation on Earth. Space is not reserved for superpowers. Space is not exclusive to wealthy nations. Space is not limited to countries with long aerospace traditions. Space is open to anyone with the commitment to build capability, the courage to challenge assumptions, and the vision to see beyond current limitations. But let me tell you why I believe this so deeply. Why I'm so certain that what we did, you can do. Why I know that African space power isn't just possible but inevitable. Because 18 months ago, I didn't believe it either. 18 months ago, when my defense minister first proposed building satellites, I thought he was dreaming. I thought it was fantasy. I thought it was the kind of ambitious idea that sounds inspiring in speeches but collapses under the weight of reality. I asked him the same questions everyone asks. How much will it cost? Where will we get the expertise? Who will train our people? How long will it take? What if we fail? What if we invest billions and end up with nothing but expensive metal floating uselessly in orbit? He didn't have perfect answers. He had honest answers. He said, "It will cost more than we've ever spent on a single project. We'll get expertise from partners willing to share, not just sell. We'll train our people the same way every spacefaring nation trained theirs, through commitment, investment, and refusal to accept failure. It will take as long as it takes. And yes, we might fail. But if we don't try, we've already failed." That conversation changed how I thought about possibility. Because he was right. Failure is guaranteed if you never attempt. Success is impossible if you never try. Progress is unachievable if you accept current limitations as permanent. So we tried, and we succeeded. Not because we're special, not because we're uniquely capable, not because Burkina Faso has some inherent advantage other African nations lack, but because we committed, because we invested, because we refused to accept that space was reserved for others. We did it. You can too. We built satellites. You can too. We developed space operations. You can too. We created capability everyone said was impossible. You can too. Let me be specific about how. Because you can too isn't just encouragement, it's a roadmap, it's a plan. It's a proven process that any African nation can follow. First, you need commitment. Not just political commitment, not just presidential speeches about space ambitions, but actual, concrete, budgetary commitment. You need to allocate resources. You need to prioritize space capability over other expenditures. You need to make hard choices about what matters most. For Burkina Faso, that meant redirecting $800 million from other programs. It meant telling ministries they'd get less funding for 3 years so we could build space capability. It meant explaining to citizens why we were investing in satellites when we still had poverty, when we still needed schools, when we still required hospitals. And you know what? The people understood, because they understood that poverty isn't solved by accepting permanent disadvantage, that development isn't achieved by remaining blind while others watch, that sovereignty isn't secured by depending on those who use that dependence against you. Second, you need partners. Not partners who sell you services. Not partners who maintain your dependence, but partners who transfer technology. Partners who share knowledge. Partners who want you to become capable, not remain reliant. For us, that partner was China. For you, it might be China. It might be any nation willing to actually transfer technology instead of just providing services. The key is finding partners whose interest aligns with your capability development. Partners who benefit from your strength, not your weakness. Partners who profit from your independence, not your dependence. Partners who see you as future equals, not permanent clients. Third, you need expertise. And this is where most African nations give up before starting. They say, we don't have space engineers, we don't have satellite technicians, we don't have the expertise required. But neither did we. 18 months ago, Burkina Faso had 0 space engineers, 0 satellite operators, 0 people with any experience in space operations. We had engineers, yes. We had technicians, yes. But none with space experience. So we trained them. We sent 37 Burkina Faso engineers to China for intensive training. 6 months. Comprehensive. Everything from satellite design to orbital mechanics to ground station operations. They learned alongside Chinese engineers. They worked on actual satellites. They operated real systems. And they came back transformed. Not just with knowledge, but with confidence. With certainty that African engineers can do anything engineers anywhere can do. With proof that space isn't more difficult than other engineering challenges. With experience that showed space is achievable if you're willing to learn. Those 37 engineers trained 200 more. Those 200 are training 1,000. Within 5 years, Burkina Faso will have more space-qualified engineers than some nations that have been in space for decades, not because we're smarter, but because we invested in training, because we committed to capability development, because we refuse to accept that expertise is something only certain nations can develop. Fourth, you need infrastructure. And this is less expensive than you think. You don't need Cape Canaveral. You don't need Baikonur Cosmodrome. You don't need massive spaceports with permanent launch facilities. You need a mobile launch platform. You need a ground station. You need a mission control center. You need data processing capability. All of it can be built for less than the cost of maintaining Western military bases on your territory for a single year. All of it can be constructed in 18 months. All of it can be operated by locally trained personnel. Our launch facility cost $60 million. Our ground station cost $40 million. Our mission control cost $30 million. Our data center cost $20 million. Total infrastructure, $150 million. Less than what we were paying annually for Western security partnerships that kept us dependent and monitored. Fifth, you need satellites. And here's what most people don't understand. You don't need to build satellites from scratch. You don't need to develop every component domestically. You don't need to achieve complete technological independence immediately. You need to buy satellites from partners willing to transfer technology. You need to assemble satellites using components from multiple sources. You need to operate satellites while learning how they work. You need to build capability progressively, not achieve perfection instantly. Our first 3 satellites were Chinese designed, jointly assembled, Burkina Faso operated. We didn't build everything, but we learned everything. We understand every system. We can maintain every component. We can operate independently. And next time, we'll build more ourselves, and the time after that, even more. That's how capability develops, progressively, incrementally, through doing, not just studying, through operating, not just observing, through building, not just buying. Join the consortium, pool your resources with ours, share our technology, train your people alongside ours, build collectively what would be difficult individually, create together what seems impossible alone. Let me tell you what joining means, what you get, what you contribute, what we build together. When you join the African Space Consortium, you get immediate access to our ground station. Your satellites can use our tracking facilities. Your missions can coordinate through our control center. Your data can process through our systems. You don't need to build everything from scratch. You can leverage what we've already built. You get access to our training programs. Your engineers can train with ours. Your technicians can learn from ours. Your scientists can work alongside ours. We'll share everything we've learned. Every mistake we made, every solution we developed, every process we refined. You get access to our technology, not just using our satellites, but understanding how they work, learning how they're built, developing capability to build your own. We're not creating dependence, we're creating capability. We're not building clients, we're building partners. And what do you contribute? Resources, expertise, capabilities. Whatever you have that strengthens the collective. Maybe you have better cybersecurity experts. Maybe you have advanced manufacturing capability. Maybe you have unique geographic positioning. Maybe you have diplomatic relationships that benefit the consortium. Everyone contributes something. Everyone benefits from everything. That's how collective capability works. That's how we build together what we couldn't build alone. Mali joined the consortium 3 days ago. They're contributing $50 million and access to their northern territory for additional launch facilities. In exchange, they'll get 2 satellites within 18 months, surveillance capability they've never had, communications security they've always needed, space presence they were told was impossible. Niger is joining next week. They're contributing $40 million and their cybersecurity expertise. They have some of the best cyber defense capabilities in West Africa. That expertise will protect our entire space infrastructure. In exchange, they'll get satellites and training and capability. Chad is negotiating terms now. They want 4 satellites. They're willing to contribute $80 million and their intelligence networks. They have extensive experience monitoring threats across the Sahel. That knowledge will make our satellite operations more effective. In exchange, they'll get comprehensive space capability. Ethiopia contacted us yesterday. They want to join. They have advanced engineering capability and aerospace research programs. They can contribute expertise we don't have. In exchange, they'll get access to everything we've built and everything we're building. Kenya is interested. Nigeria is interested. South Africa is interested. Egypt is interested. Within a year, the consortium will have 15 members. Within 5 years, 30. Eventually, the entire continent. And together, we'll build what no single nation could build alone. We'll operate 50 satellites within 5 years, 100 within 10 years, 200 within 15 years. Eventually, thousands. Comprehensive surveillance coverage of the entire continent, communications networks independent of Western control, navigation systems that don't depend on GPS, weather monitoring that serves African needs, resource tracking that protects African wealth, environmental monitoring that preserves African ecology, all of it owned by Africa, operated by Africans, serving African interests, creating African capability, ensuring African sovereignty. Because the future of Africa depends on our ability to see, to monitor our own territory, to track our own resources, to watch our own borders, to operate with the same visibility that powerful nations have used to maintain advantage over us. Let me tell you why visibility matters so much, why satellites are about more than military advantage, why space capability is about more than surveillance, why this is about sovereignty, not just security. For decades, Western nations have watched Africa from space. They've monitored our resources, they've tracked our minerals, they've identified our wealth, and they've used that information to extract what they found, to exploit what they identified, to take what they discovered. They knew where the gold was before we did. They knew where the diamonds were before we mapped them. They knew where the oil was before we drilled. They knew where the rare earth elements were before we understood their value, and they used that knowledge to take what was ours while we remained blind to what we had. That's what visibility means. That's what satellites enable. That's what space power creates. Not just seeing, but knowing. Not just monitoring, but understanding. Not just watching, but acting on what you see. Our satellites have already identified mineral deposits we didn't know existed, resources worth billions. Wealth we can now protect instead of losing to foreign companies who saw from space what we couldn't see from the ground. Our satellites have already tracked illegal mining operations, foreign companies extracting our resources without authorization. Theft we can now stop instead of discovering years later after the wealth is gone. Our satellites have already monitored environmental destruction, deforestation we can now prevent, pollution we can now address, ecological damage we can now stop before it becomes irreversible. That's what 6 days ago means. That's what 3 satellites represent. That's what African space power creates. That's what's now possible that wasn't possible before. And that future is now possible. Not someday. Not eventually. Not in some distant timeline. Now. Today. Because we proved it's possible. Because we built the foundation. Because we created the capability. Because we showed that African space power is real. But let me be honest about something. Something that needs to be said. Something that explains why this matters more than just technology or capability or even sovereignty. This is about belief. About what we believe is possible. About what we believe we deserve. About what we believe we can achieve. For too long, Africans have been taught that certain things are beyond us, that certain capabilities are reserved for others, that certain achievements are impossible for African nations. That space is for superpowers, not for us. That satellites are for wealthy nations, not for us. That advanced technology is for countries with long traditions, not for us. And we believed it, we internalized it, we accepted it, we structured our ambitions around it, we limited our vision because of it. We constrained our potential because we believed the limitations others imposed were real. But they're not real, they're constructed, they're maintained, they're enforced not through physical impossibility but through psychological control. Through making us believe we can't, so we never try. Through convincing us it's impossible, so we never attempt. Through ensuring we accept our limitations, so we never challenge them. That's what launching satellites breaks. Not just Western monopoly on space, but African belief in our limitations. Not just their control of orbital surveillance, but our acceptance that we can't compete. Not just their advantage, but our disadvantage mindset. Because once you prove that space is achievable, everything else becomes achievable too. Once you demonstrate that satellites are possible, all technology becomes possible. Once you show that African nations can operate in space, African capability in every domain becomes believable. That's the real power of what we did, not the satellites themselves, but the proof they provide, proof that African technical excellence is real, proof that African engineering capability is genuine, proof that African space power is achievable, proof that we can do anything if we commit to doing it. To the people of Africa, 6 days ago, your continent entered space, not as passengers on someone else's rockets, not as clients buying someone else's services, but as operators, as builders, as engineers, as scientists, as a continent developing its own capability. Your continent can now see, can monitor, can track, can watch, can operate with the same visibility that powerful nations have used to maintain advantage over you, can achieve the same awareness that has enabled their control, can develop the same capability that has ensured their dominance. Let me tell you what that means for you personally, for your life, for your future, for your children's future. Because this isn't just about governments and militaries and geopolitics. This is about you. It means the resources in your country will be harder to steal, because we can see when foreign companies extract without authorization, because we can monitor when wealth is taken without compensation, because we can track when your national patrimony is being exploited. It means your environment will be better protected, because we can see deforestation in real time, because we can track environmental destruction before it becomes irreversible, because we can act to protect what sustains you. It means your security will improve, because we can see terrorist movements before they reach your village, because we can monitor threats before they materialize, because we can track dangerous actors before they strike, because we can provide warning that saves lives. It means your agriculture will become more productive, because we can monitor weather patterns more accurately, because we can track water resources more effectively, because we can identify optimal planting times more precisely, because we can help you grow more food with less waste. It means your children will have opportunities you never had, because space engineering is now an African career, because satellite operations are now African jobs, because space science is now African education, because your children can aspire to work in space, not just dream about it. That's what 6 days ago means. That's what 3 satellites represent. That's what African space power creates. That's what's now possible that wasn't possible before. I received a letter yesterday from a 12-year-old girl in a village outside Ouagadougou. Her name is Aminata. She wrote, "Mr. President, my teacher told us about the satellites. She said Burkina Faso is in space now. She said African engineers built them. She said I could be a space engineer too if I study hard and believe it's possible." She wrote, "I didn't know that was possible. I thought space was for Americans and Russians and Chinese. I thought Africans couldn't do that. I thought we had to be something else. But now I know we can be anything. Now I know space is for us too. Now I know I can dream about working in space, and it's not just a dream, it's a possibility." She wrote, "Thank you for showing me that African girls can reach space. Thank you for proving that our dreams aren't limited by where we're born. Thank you for making me believe that I can achieve anything." That letter is why I did this. Not for military advantage, not for geopolitical positioning, not for strategic leverage, but for Aminata, for every African child who now knows that space is possible, for every young person who now believes that African capability is unlimited, for every student who now understands that their dreams aren't constrained by others' limitations. That's the real victory, not the satellites orbiting above, but the dreams taking flight below, not the technology in space, but the belief on Earth, not what we achieved, but what we made possible for everyone who comes after us. Look up at the night sky. 3 of those points of light are ours. African satellites, Burkina Faso technology, continental capability, orbiting above, watching below, providing security through visibility. And when you look up, understand what you're seeing. You're not just seeing satellites, you're seeing proof that African engineering is real, proof that African capability is genuine, proof that African space power is achievable, proof that we belong in space as much as any nation on Earth. You're seeing your future, your children's future, your continent's future. A future where Africa operates in space as equals, where African nations see with the same clarity as any power, where African capability matches African potential, where African achievement reflects African possibility. You're seeing freedom, freedom from dependence on others' satellites, freedom from relying on others' visibility, freedom from accepting others' control of what can be seen from above, freedom to see for ourselves, freedom to know for ourselves, freedom to act on what we see. And soon there will be more. Many more. Dozens. Hundreds. Eventually, thousands. An African presence in space that matches our presence on Earth. A continental capability that ensures we're never again blind to what others see. A space program that proves African technical excellence is undeniable. Mali's satellites will launch in 6 months. Niger's will follow 3 months later. Chad's within a year. Ethiopia's within 18 months. Kenya's, Nigeria's, South Africa's, Egypt's. One by one, African nations entering space. One by one, African capability growing. One by one, African presence in orbit expanding. All of it owned by Africa, all of it operated by Africans, all of it serving African interests, all of it proving African capability, all of it ensuring African sovereignty. To U.S. Space Command, to Western space agencies, to everyone who monopolized space and used that monopoly to control Africa, I have one message. Your exclusive access is over. Your surveillance monopoly is broken. Your advantage is gone. We can see now. We can monitor now. We can track now. We can watch now. And we're not just catching up. We're innovating. We're developing capabilities you didn't anticipate. We're creating systems you didn't expect. We're building networks you didn't prepare for. Our satellites are smaller, more efficient, more capable than you expected. Our ground stations are more sophisticated than you assumed. Our operations are more professional than you predicted. Our capability is more comprehensive than you calculated. You thought African space programs would be primitive, would be dependent, would be limited, would be controllable. You were wrong on every count. We're building advanced capability. We're operating independently. We're expanding rapidly. We're succeeding beyond your expectations and beyond your ability to control. The beginning of an Africa that refuses limitations, that challenges assumptions, that achieves the impossible, that becomes what we choose to become. This is just the beginning, and the future is unlimited. And Africa will never be blind again. We are Burkina Faso, we are Africa, we are in space, and we will never surrender that capability again.